Showcase has a kind of an interesting history. There's a lot that happened here to create World Showcase and make it come together. So what I wanted to do was in a couple of videos to kind of share with you how World Showcase came together. And I'll tell you all about pavilions, sort of the history of it, and the history of the entirety of World Showcase and kind of how that came to be. I've told you some of the pieces to it, but it's interesting to hear the whole story and how it all kind of came to pass. There's a lot of interesting backstory there about what it is, and the pavilions themselves have some interesting stories anyway. So it's kind of fun to listen to how they came together. So as I think about how to break this down, I think for the first video, what I'm going to do is talk about the overview, and then bring in the two Asian countries. I'll bring in Japan and China and talk about them. So that'll be my first video right here.
I feel a little bit like Columbus felt when he started on his journey into the New World. Because on the other side of this man-made lagoon is a brand new man-made world. And in that world, there are 9 countries that are thousands of miles apart geographically. And they're joined together in a 1-mile area to display their culture, their art, and their historical achievements. And the best part of this is that you don't even have to go through customs to enjoy it. Reflected in the waters of this man-made inland sea, there's a vision of the future of our world as it might be. The fragments of a miracle are falling into place in this showcase for the entire human race. People to people, culture to culture, nation to nation, coming forth and joining hands. This is World Showcase, the substance, the essence, the coming together of youth from distant lands, growing and learning from each other, sensing the needs of one another. A fellowship of youngsters with a special dream to share, their different customs blending in a mixture rich and rare. The need was never greater for all people everywhere, so the Imagineers devised this wondrous plan, the World Showcase of the family of man. Ladies and gentlemen, these handsome and rather intelligent young people are part of a group who make up a kind of an interesting program called World Showcase Fellowship. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're from the various countries represented in the World Showcase, and they work here and study here, and they're sort of unofficial ambassadors for their native countries.
Was a means to bring the world closer together. So different countries would come and represent their country. And sometimes they would have a show, and sometimes they would have an attraction, and sometimes they would have some movie or something like that. But it was a true world showcase in a way. So I think Walt Disney kind of took that and said, you know, there's a really good idea there, and it's too bad that they don't do this all the time, that it's only once in a while, that we could have a regular meeting of people coming together and talking about world events and talking about themselves and their culture and what makes them unique. So from the 1975 annual report to shareholders, beyond the scientific and technological aspects of Epcot, the project holds great promise for the advancements of international cooperation and understanding. The World Showcase, planned for opening in late 1979, will be devoted to this goal. An ongoing international exposition, for which an admission will be charged, the World Showcase will communicate the culture, heritage, history, technology, trade, tourism, and future goals of the participating nations. It will consist of a coordinated series of national pavilions housed side by side in 2 dramatic semicircular structures. These dynamic structures will face each other across a courtyard of nations, where there will be a major theater for performances by international celebrities and entertainment groups, and where parades, pageants, and special events will be staged by entertainers from the participating nations. Although these national pavilions may vary in size, each will enjoy an equal facade exposure to the guest. The entire complex will be tied together by a Disney people-moving system that will offer visitors a preview look into each attraction. Unlike a World's Fair, it will offer participating countries a permanent installation for such features as themed restaurants and shops, product exhibits, industrial displays, cultural presentations, a trade center, and even special facilities for business meetings. A major part of each pavilion will be the Disney-designed ride or attraction, which will give guests a foretaste of an actual visit to the country. National musical groups or other performing artists could present special entertainment on a continuing basis. Each participating nation will be asked to provide the capital to cover the cost of designing, developing, constructing an attraction or ride and all exhibits, as well as the pavilion itself. It will also have the responsibility for funding the housing for its employees in the International Village. Its land lease will cover the cost of maintaining the attraction for a minimum of 10 years. The Disney organization will be responsible for area development, including the construction of transportation systems and utilities. We will also build and operate the International People Moving System, the Courtyard of Nations, and the Central Theater facility. It didn't quite pan out that way. It sort of grew out a little bit and became more of the facades around a lake instead of around a central theater. And you only had one circle. You may also have noticed that they were asking each country to pay for some portion of it, or essentially to have a 10-year contract to be able to provide for the maintenance of the facility. So if you think about the 10-year commitment, it's similar to what they were doing at Disneyland. When Walt Disney needed an influx of capital, he would work with a company to actually provide some sponsorship for a particular attraction, and typically those lasted for 10 years. They would have their name emblazoned on it for that 10-year period, and they would have some say in what the attraction was and did. So really kind of interesting, because it's the same concept, just applied to countries instead of applied to individual attractions. Though each one of the individual countries would have an attraction in it, or some sort of a show or something. So really kind of neat. He had the concept there, and I think it draws on what Walt Disney had already been doing up to that point. Now, of course, they didn't complete the whole of Epcot in 1979. They completed it by 1982, and part of the reason for that was because of this other piece to the puzzle. So that also took more planning and design, because you essentially doubled the size of the park, and I think you increased the complexity pretty dramatically too. So very clever that they were able to put it together this way and come up with something that really kind of talked about the World Showcase pavilions and sort of creating a permanent World's Fair, because that really was something that he had an interest in. Now, the thing is, there was some talk about calling it a World's Fair instead of a World Showcase. But the problem is that there's a group called the Bureau of International Expositions, and they're based out of Paris. They actually manage and sanction the World's Fairs that happen. And as it happens, the World's Fair is a temporary exhibit that's brought by each nation individually. Because this would be a permanent exhibit that would be constructed by a corporation, it wouldn't qualify as a World's Fair. So while Disney did keep the BIE apprised of what they were doing, they were never sanctioned as a World's Fair. So it really had to go in a different direction and become the World Showcase. Jack Lindquist, who was the president of advertising, publicity, and promotion and public relations for the Walt Disney Productions in the early 1980s, said that because of the difficulty of establishing any kind of a real community life in a place where there are thousands of tourists that would come tramping through every day, we could have called Epcot Center anything. But if we had opened it under another name, the media would have been asking, but when are you going to open Epcot? In an important sense, Epcot Center is the whole 27,500 acres we own there in Florida. In designing Epcot's Japan Pavilion, Walt Disney Imagineers incorporated Japanese design principles of balance, harmony, simplicity, formality, and delicacy to evoke a sense of serenity, but adding in characteristic features of traditional Japanese settings. The design flows aesthetically. A central entry point spanning from the Torii Gate on the lagoon to the palace walls with an open courtyard, a majestic pagoda on one side, and another large building, the ceremonial house, on the other. One interesting thing is that the Japan Pavilion features more recreations of actual buildings or landmarks than perhaps any other World Showcase pavilion. So you'll hear me talk about reference points and actual places as I discuss things. The most recognizable feature of the pavilion, and the one that can be seen around the lagoon, is the red Torii Gate that's out on the lagoon. The one that you see in Epcot is based on the one that's at the entrance to the Itsukushima Shrine on the inland sea in what's popularly known as Miyajima. While this one exists in an island off the coast of Japan, it's certainly not the only torii that you will find around Japan. Torii gates can be found all over the place. Now, a torii is a traditional Japanese gate most commonly found at the entrance of or within a Shinto shrine, where it symbolically marks the transition from the profane to the sacred. The presence of the torii at the entrance is usually the simplest way to identify a Shinto shrine. There's something cool about this torii, and it's about the attention to detail.
It's been weathered to appear as though it's been exposed to the sun, water, and wind for centuries. Imagineers added barnacles and crustaceans to give it an even more weathered look. You might expect to find barnacles as if this were in the ocean. It gives it a sense of authenticity, and it's that attention to detail that really makes it special. As you stand at the gate and look toward the pavilion, you'll notice several distinct structures and some hills with gardens and a castle in the distance. A unique feature of Japan is the wide-open courtyard. It's one of the few countries in the Epcot where you won't feel hemmed while enjoying the sights. You may also notice that the Japanese color palettes are somewhat subdued and subtle. The gardens and grounds in Japan have a manicured, well-ordered appearance that kind of complements that. Now, the pagoda to your left is Goju no To. It's a 5-story pagoda. And the design of Epcot's pagoda was inspired by the 7th century Horyuju temple in Nara. It stands 85 feet tall. Now, the 5 tiers of the pagoda represent in ascending order the elements from which the Buddhist believes that all things in the universe are created: earth, water, fire, wind, and sky. On the roof is a sorin, a finial. Looking toward the back of the pavilion, we see a castle or fortress up on the hill. This one is based on the 17th century Shirasagi-jo, a castle overlooking Himeji. The original fortress is one of the best preserved fortresses of early Japan. Since this is a representation of the original, Imagineers use forced perspective to make it seem like you're approaching the castle as you walk straight back through the wide entryway. As you exit the courtyard in the back, you enter a massive wooden stone Nijo entry to the castle. Look around here while you're standing there. On either side, there are large statues of mounted samurai soldiers positioned around, as though they are guarding the castle and ready to protect it. Passing through the Nijo, you cross a wide bridge spanning a moat. Now, if you stand back at the torii gate and look to your right, you'll see another building. This is the imposing 2-story Shishienden, inspired by the Gosho Ceremonial and Coronation Hall found in the Imperial Palace grounds of Kyoto. Kyoto, of course, was the original capital of Japan. The Shishienden was built in 794. It's said to be one of the first true styles of Japanese architecture. Their first floor of the Shishienden contains a gift shop presented by the world-famous Mitsukoshi department store. Now, this store is unique, special, and, truth be told, very un-Disney-like in some ways. Mitsukoshi was founded in 1673 as Ichigoya, selling kimonos. 10 years later, in 1683, Ichigoya took a new approach to marketing. Instead of selling by going door to door, they set up a store where buyers could purchase goods on the spot with cash. The owner also founded the Mitsui Group, and so the store later became Mitsukoshi, and that means that it's the oldest and largest department store in the world. Now, Mitsukoshi has 5 stores in Japan, 4 of them in Tokyo. They also have about a dozen stores that are licensed throughout Asia, but not owned by Mitsukoshi. But the one in Epcot is owned and operated by the department store chain itself. The cast members who work there are all Japanese and work for Mitsukoshi, as vendors at Disney. It's remarkable how they've captured the essence of the store with the outpost in Florida. There are wonderful displays of items from Japan, including dolls, fine porcelains, kimonos, Japanese handcrafts, elegant jewelry, snacks, kitchenware, cookbooks, kids' toys, and so much more. And you can't leave without seeing the Kimono Boutique, showcasing amazingly beautiful kimonos and accessories, and this, of course, pays homage to the origins of the Mitsukoshi brand. It's surprising how much there is in this store. Sometimes it can be a learning experience. There are a number of signs that have been placed around the store, providing you with the history of some of the goods they offer. In addition, the cast members are more than happy to chat with you and share stories about their country, or answer any questions you might have about the merchandise. Leading up to the second floor is a large staircase, and that leads to the second floor, which is known as the Hall of Ceremonies. Now let's take a look at the grounds and the gardens. The Imagineers and horticulturalists did a terrific job of capturing the spirit of traditional Japanese gardens and meshing them with the buildings to give you an immersive experience that really makes you feel like you're in Japan, perhaps just outside of Tokyo. The area is filled with Japanese pools and gardens, but Japan is much further north than Florida, so it's impossible to recreate all manner of trees and shrubs, but they used as many as they could and found similar substitutes to stand in for Florida's tropical environment. Still, you'll find Japanese maples, bamboo, monkey puzzle trees, and other native plantings, which provide a tranquil garden setting. In Japan, gardening is a precise art. Every object and its placement in the garden has a special meaning. Here, activity, symbolism, and reverence for nature blend in with the intense maintenance to create a garden with a truly unique beauty.
A typical Japanese garden contains a number of different elements in its design. These include water, rocks and sand, bridges, architecture, lanterns, fences, trees and flowers, and fish. All of these can be found in the Japan Pavilion Gardens. Japanese consider water to be a life source, and thus is abundant at the Japan Pavilion. Water also represents the sea, which is important to Japanese life. Rocks in Japan represent the enduring nature of Earth. Bridges symbolize transition, the passing from one segment of your life to another. Traditional Japanese architecture has been characterized by wooden structures elevated slightly off the ground with tiled or thatched roofs. Inside sliding wooden doors were used in place of walls, allowing for customization of space depending on the need. Stone lanterns were introduced by tea masters to guide guests through their gardens to the tea ceremonies held in the evening. Fences are often used in Japanese gardens to compartmentalize. A fence can add a beauty and helps divide one section of the garden from another. Evergreen trees are symbols of eternal life and are plentiful in the Japan Pavilion. Azaleas, native to several continents, including Asia, can also be found here. Koi are simply domesticated carp that are used to decorate ponds and water gardens. They were first bred by the Japanese in the 1820s for their distinctive color. Unlike traditional gardens, rock gardens have no water features. Instead, gravel or sand represents the sea, ocean, rivers, or lakes, and sometimes even the sky. In front of the Shishienden, you will find a foliage garden with lanterns, rocks, and other things to relax. You may also notice a stone statue on the corner near the World Showcase walkway. This statue was a gift from the government of Japan when the Magic Kingdom opened and was moved to Epcot's Japan Pavilion in 1981. You can, of course, find a jewelry section in Mitsukoshi. And you might actually classify this as more of a show or an experience than simply just retail. A store within a store specializes in Mikimoto pearls. In addition to the preset items that you can buy, you can do something called pick a pearl. Large tanks of oysters are set near the counter, and for under $20 you can pick an oyster, and they'll open it for you, and you get whatever pearl is inside. If you follow the pathway over the moat, you have a door to your right, and that's the backside of the Mitsukoshi store. In front of you is the Bijutsu-kan. This is sort of a museum of things that are distinctly Japanese. It's an art gallery dedicated to sharing a collection of Japanese arts. In the past, they've done anime, tin toys, arts, kimonos, and other cultural things. Now, another always fun thing to do is to see the Matsurisa. Taiko have a mythological origin in Japanese folklore. In feudal Japan, taikos were often used to motivate troops, call out orders or announcements, and set a marching pace. Estimates of the number of taiko groups in Japan vary anywhere from 800 to 5,000. And now we move on to what nearly was. Now certainly there's a lot to see and do in Japan, but what most people don't know is that there's a completed show building that's behind the Bijutsu-kan, or behind the castle walls if you want to look at it that way. There was a plan to open an attraction called Winds of Change, or Meet the World, in that space. So as you look around in this part of the building, you'll see that there's a pair of double doors over there, right behind me. Those doors are how you get into the Meet the World show. So the actual show pavilion is actually there, it's built. It's not accessible, but that's where you would get into it. So there you go, kind of interesting the way they built it, but never put a show in there. And still haven't after all these years. Now they did open a version of Meet the World in Tokyo Disneyland that closely resembled what they were planning on putting at Epcot. The show was, probably the right word is unusual. The show provided an account of Japan's history and combined film, music, and audio animatronics to depict key moments from several thousands of years worth of Japan's folklore and fact. It was set on a revolving stage, kind of like the Carousel of Progress, and Meet the World had something else in common with the nostalgic look at American history. It featured a theme song written by the Sherman Brothers.
But where did she come from?
Your imagination. What's far more important is that you know where you've come from.
For Meet the World, the audience would sit in the middle of the building on a rotating turntable and face outwards, toward the stationary stages. This is just the opposite of Carousel of Progress, which has the audience sitting on the outside looking in. Meet the World presented a history of Japan in 4 acts. As the audience rotated through the various acts, the island nation's volcanic beginnings were discussed, along with trading with other nations, isolationism, and reopening of the country, and their promising future. So what happened, and why didn't it actually open here? But surely one of the primary reasons was the way that Japan's role prior to World War II was depicted in the presentation. It really wasn't addressed at all.
Awfully dark.
Yes, it was dark. But that's all over now.
The future is filled with promise and possibility, so there's a lesson we learned from Epcot, that you never know what the promise of the future holds. First off, let me give you a quick history of China to set the stage. It's the world's second largest country in terms of its total area. Its history begins nearly 1 million years ago, but it's most remarkable for the various dynasties that ruled the land for hundreds or even thousands of years at a time. These dynasties started somewhere around 2100 BCE and lasted for nearly 4,000 years. But nothing lasts forever. Wars, isolationism, infighting, and other factors led to the fall of the last Chinese dynasty. And in 1912, China became the Republic of China, which now had a president instead of a ruling empire. During the Second World War, Chiang Kai-shek ruled the mainland, but as the war drew to a close, he was effectively run out of town and out of the country, and he moved to the island of Taiwan, breaking it from the Republic as he lived in exile. Taiwan still has somewhat of a muddled international status, as many countries refer to it as Chinese Taipei. It was the Communist Party that drove Chiang Kai-shek out, and in 1949 they reformed as the People's Republic of China, and effectively closed their borders to the rest of the world, much as the last dynasty had done. For the most part, intrigue surrounded this land. Westerners had a brief glimpse of what China was like in the nearly 50 years it was the Republic, but now that it was closed again, it became an exotic and somewhat mysterious land to others around the world. Chairman Mao Zedong kept the country as an isolationist nation, until something called ping-pong diplomacy took over. Yes, it was based around an actual ping-pong match, and Richard Nixon visited in the early 1970s. At that time, we started to see through the borders and finally got a peek at China again. And here we are in the 1970s, as Disney is considering what pavilions might work in Epcot. Wanting to embrace multiple cultures, and to put aside the cold shoulder that went along with the Cold War, Disney thought representing a communist country was intriguing and courted both China and the Soviet Union as host nations. Both countries showed some amount of interest, but the Soviet Union insisted that its communist doctrine be a focal point of the pavilion. Disney was happy to represent aspects of the nation, but didn't want to go that far. They wanted the pavilion to be a showcase of the culture, the people, the heritage, and food, and not overtly represent the politics and social doctrines of communism. China, with its newfound open borders and interest in standing on a world stage and letting more people see who they really were, was more than willing to show the world their country and its many treasures. And that's how China came to be a World Showcase Pavilion. China is steeped in ancient traditions and beliefs. Many still practice them today. Now, the China Pavilion is perhaps the most detailed of all the pavilions in terms of the overall flow and the architecture. There are so many architectural styles, statues, gardens, and even colors that have meaning in Chinese lore, history, and everyday life. Right near where the Joy of Tea shop is located, here you see 3 separate rock formations, with benches and trees arranged around them as part of the design. This was done to represent the ancient Chinese belief that unusual rock formations brought inner peace and serenity. The design of these formations is surprising. It's meant to look simple, but is fairly complex in design. In Chinese lore, it was thought that intense contemplation involving strange rock formations would bring peace and contentment. The emperors of older China actually sought out and brought such rocks to their palaces. If you look long enough, you start to see figures emerge. Dragons, serpents, and other mythical creatures have been called out by guests. Are any of them actually there? That's part of what makes this interesting. By examining them, you're following the tradition and finding that inner peace as you stare at the rocks. Now turn around and face the pavilion. But the immediate feature you see is a gate with a walkway and a building behind that. Off to the right is a garden.
The gate is the Zhaoyan Men, or Gate of the Golden Sun. This is a reproduction of a gate that's found at the Summer Palace that's located about 9 miles north of Beijing. The Summer Palace itself was always the playground of royalty. As you peer through the gate, you should notice that China seems to be divided into two sections. The left side is more commercial. The right is more picturesque. It represents China as a country with its growing commercial business set among the beauty of the traditional Chinese culture. First, we'll explore the garden side because it's the larger portion. After entering the pavilion, guests come across a lotus pool surrounded by a typical Chinese garden with a winding path off to the right. But let's go up the main pathway first. There's a little courtyard just inside the gate. That's used for various activities, character greetings, shows, and sometimes even for a Disney wedding. We'll cross the bridge, and we're headed toward the building called the Temple of Heaven, which was meant to be the weenie to bring people in. What is this building that's behind the gate? Let's walk toward it. That's the whole idea of the weenie. It's a beautiful and detailed reproduction of a building of the same name, built between 1406 and 1420 during the reign of the Yongle Empire as part of the complex located southeast of central Beijing. Disney's version is a half-scale of the original building. It's designed to look as though you are ascending into the sky. The area inside the temple is known as the Hall of Prayer for Good Harvests. Here the emperor would pray and would also make sacrifices during the winter solstice to ensure a good harvest in the spring. As we step inside, look around at the detail. It's pretty amazing. There's a significance in the arrangement and placement of everything that's in here. There are 12 columns supporting the roof. They represent the months of the year and the 12-year cycle of the Chinese calendar. There are 4 additional columns, and they represent the 4 seasons. Now look up at the dome. You'll see a golden dragon and a phoenix with a pearl. Now if we step outside and look to our right, next to the Hall of Prayers is the House of the Whispering Willows. There have been other exhibits, including artifacts on loan from the Republic of China's Peace Museum, that have made their way through the House of the Whispering Willows. If you step back outside and head in front of the temple again, look to your left. We see the winding path I mentioned before. The path goes around the lotus pool and back toward the entrance, to the pavilion. The garden is in the area between the path and the main bridge you use to come across to the temple. These gardens are typical of China's 6 top gardens located in Shanghai, Suzhou, Beijing, and Lhasa. But this one is mostly inspired by the gardens found in Suzhou, a large city near Shanghai. The path is usually not crowded, and it's a way to step away into a serene and quiet setting. There are footbridges, bamboo gardens, and a small waterfall and ponds to see and enjoy. The trees seen along the path are native to China. One that's represented is the contorted mulberry tree, which is important to the silk industry in China. Silk moths build their cocoons in these trees, and other species are the camellia bush and the native bamboo trees. And by the way, the camellia bush is where the tea of the same name comes from. Starting back at the entrance again, let's head into the business part of the pavilion. On your left is the sit-down Nine Dragons restaurant, followed by the quick service location. Continuing on, guests walk down a walkway which is called the Street of Good Fortune, which was inspired by the roadways found in Beijing. In fact, Disney Imagineers intentionally made the path more narrow than the guest capacity would dictate in order to have guests experience the crowded conditions of modern China. Look up as you walk along. You'll notice curved eaves on the roofs of the buildings. They are curved to keep out evil spirits. But on the majority of the eaves, you'll see a terracotta portrayal of Prince Min straddling a hen followed by a troop of animals behind him. He was so cruel to his subjects that he was hanged. He's portrayed on the buildings in effigy as a warning to other rulers, and the animals behind him prevented his escape. Now take a look at the entrance to the House of Good Fortune, the main shop. You'll notice 2 noble-looking lions standing guard. Lions are considered the king of all the animals. Under the paw of the lion on your right, there's a ball, and the lion on the left has a lion cub. The cub epitomizes offspring, and the ball, unity of empire. So they're both very important in Chinese culture. Near the back, be sure to inspect the unique Bianzhong bell. These bells were usually in a set, an odd number of course, given the numerology significance. These sets of chime bells were used as musical instruments, and some of the bells have been dated between 2,000 and 3,600 years old. They had no clappers, but were struck with a wooden mallet. Check out the building on the right side. There's a nod to the influence of Western culture in China, a telephone booth that seems out of place, but is truly intentional in its placement. China is one of the 2 places that still have a Circle Vision movie, Reflections of China. It's a stunning modern depiction of China today using the 9-camera rig to capture a complete view of everything around you. The show lasts for 13 minutes, and as we've discussed, it's only standing room in the building, but you're watching the theater around you. Now, this film replaces the original offering at the pavilion. This was not at the request of the Chinese government. Rather, it was reflective of the fact that China made many advances over the years, and we've learned so much more about the country in the 40-ish years since they opened their doors, and the 30 years since Epcot's been around. So in 2003, this film started a new run. The movie features footage of China, including the Great Wall, the Forbidden City of Beijing, the Gobi Desert, Inner Mongolia, and the Yangtze River, and the tropical rainforest of Hainan Island.
Ah, China. When one thinks of this magnificent country, one cannot help but envision the Wanli Changcheng. The Great Wall. It once stretched like a mighty dragon across 4,000 miles of China. Welcome. I am Li Bai, a poet of the Tang Dynasty, and I have returned to share with you reflections of my beloved China. Like this great wall, it winds like a road across timeless landscapes, but one can also find landscapes that are ever changing.
The film was 19 minutes long and gave the world a view of China as it had never seen before. The film explored Beijing's Forbidden City, the windy steeps of Mongolia, the 2,400-year-old Great Wall, and the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the fierce emperor who was laid to rest guarded by his army of life-size soldiers. Now, the actor who played Li Bai was actually Ki Luke. He played number one's son in the early versions of the Charlie Chan films in the 1930s, and was the original Kato in the Green Hornet film serials from 1939 to 1941. He was known as one of the most prominent Asian actors in American cinema in the mid-20th century.